For many people, The Bends is Radiohead's best album. Today, we're going to have a look at why it's become so iconic. It's turning 30 this year. Hello to you, Al. Now, for a man in his 40s, I think you were just out of nappies when this got released. What does this album mean to you?
Good morning, mate. Yeah, I absolutely love doing these episodes. And you're right, 30 years. I was 13 at the time when this album came out. You do the maths. Look, I've listened to a couple of songs recently. Like Bones is played on this episode of Afterlife at the end, and that kind of got me interested, as well as the fact Tom York doing his solo stuff, hearing Fake Plastic Trees again live. I was just like, this album needs to be listened to again, mate. So I'm kind of pumped.
This is interesting. We've got to take our minds back to before the Bends. Creep was an amazing hit for the band. They toured quite successfully. They weren't really wanting to do Creep 2, although I'm sure a lot of people out there at the time were looking for that. But I think after a lot of touring, Tom York had started developing this craft of songwriting, and a lot of people were really taking note of it. But when it came out, Al, I think a lot of people were fairly underwhelmed in general. I mean, I wasn't really rooting for Radiohead at the time. I mean, I heard Creep on the charts. I wasn't really thinking that this was going to be an amazing band. I was thinking Ugly Kid Joe, Spin Doctors. I'm not sure if that's in line with what you were looking for there.
No, not really. I mean, we do have to remember that Creep was such a massive hit that was not even meant to be a hit from the band. It was meant to, I believe, to be a B-side, and it ended up being on Pablo Honey and kind of just went gangbusters. So I think it's been really interesting to kind of listen to this again and doing a bit more research. And I didn't realise how much pressure the band were on to produce singles for this album. So it's really kind of interesting doing some research to see just how challenging it was for Tom York and the rest of the band to, over time, kind of collate this album, which is now retrospectively kind of seen as a classic album. And some people are saying, it's top 5 album of all time. But at the time, the initial reviews were kind of hovering around the 3 stars, because I believe people were just looking for that next Creep hit, especially in the US, where they didn't actually release the first single, My Own Lung, which was released in the UK as a bit of a fan favourite. In the US, they released Fake Plastic Trees, and it didn't quite go as well as what they were hoping for. I don't know, mate. I think there's some hidden gems on this album, if we're going to give it a critique. I particularly like the last half of the album. The last 4 songs for me really expose Tom York's voice. A song like Bulletproof, I hadn't heard that song for years, mate. That is absolutely sensational.
Yeah, it's good. It's a good song.
If we're going to critique it more, mate, where are you on this?
I find it fascinating examining where this album sits compared to where they ended up being. So you've got to remember the before, which is Pablo Honey, the after was OK Computer.
Yep.
The types of sounds in the record are not what you see in later records. So you're seeing a lot of jangly guitars, sort of almost proto-Smiths, but in a lot of ways, you're hearing a lot of the sounds of Britpop in those early 90s, which is something they did less of as time went by. So that's the first thing you notice. The second thing is that you're starting to hear these atmospheric, so these sinister sounds that weren't in Pablo Honey, but you'd obviously start hearing them in OK Computer, and that's become their trademark in a lot of ways. So it's very interesting to hear how it's transitioned. The vocal-led stuff's also interesting. You seem to have still almost a quietish verse and this big chorus, and that's sort of a trademark of the time in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
but
definitely.
Again, you saw less of them doing that. So I really liked at the time, as I said, I wasn't really buzzed about Radiohead. It probably where Just came out, so that film clip I remember on Rage in Australian television, like MTV,
so
that
good.
came out. It's a great song, and it was really the first time for me that I thought, oh, hang on, this band is something a little bit different. So some of the Senator interludes with that song I really like. Street Spirit's another one. I've always loved that song, and that was a top 5 hit. I had no idea. I'd forgotten about that song as being a top 5 hit.
So they've released 6 singles off this album, mate.
They did. I mean, all the ones you hear of is like My Iron Lung. Yep. High and Dry. I mean, there is lots of hits here, but that song was the last one that they released. And for some reason, I kind of feel as if that might have given the band some confidence to go into the territory they went in with OK Computer. So there is a ton of good stuff. I would say that this is probably, even though I think people were looking at the time and scratching their heads, it's probably their most commercial album. And I think that's a reason why people see this as being their favourite album. There's just lots of good bangers, but bangers in a singles type of way. I think what they went on to be is more of an albums band, obviously. So that's really where this album is. You're probably your entry point for a lot of casual Radiohead fans. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on reference points, because you got to remember at the time that they sound a little bit different to what they ended up sounding like. I was hearing references of Manic Street Preachers, Jeff Buckley. I was also thinking, well, without the bands, we probably might not have heard of Travis, right? And then we might not have heard of Coldplay. That's an interesting. I'm interested to know what you're hearing of the sounds and really going back to the time.
Oh, absolutely. And it's interesting you mentioned the Manics, because, of course, they had just released the Holy Bible, which was basically kind of, that was a pretty dark and kind of heavy album. But in terms of bands like Travis that were to come on the scene a bit later, you can hear that kind of on The Man Who, where the particular song, As You Are, where he's kind of screaming towards the end there. It was almost like this license to actually just do whatever you want. And I feel like that kind of sums up this album, really. And you mentioned before that it's an album full of bangers, but for me, it's not just that. It's a cohesive album from start to finish. And you also touched on Jeff Buckley too, and an interesting point there is the fact, which I didn't know before rediscovering this album, is that, of course, Tom York originally recorded Fake Plastic Trees and just didn't quite like it. Went out and saw a Jeff Buckley gig, went back, re-recorded it, and it became the song that it is today. So I don't know. That's why I love doing these episodes, mate, because you're learning more about that particular band at that particular time. And for me, there's some really fresh insights there. So if we're going to give it a rating now, mate, this is an absolute 5-star album for me. It would be probably in the top 10 albums of all time. I actually rate it higher than OK Computer, and I know that you're probably going to say a few things there, but absolutely enjoyable from start to finish. And if there's anyone watching this who hasn't played this album, I'm very jealous, because it would be an absolute pleasure to listen to it for the first time.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a 5-star album. I'm still not seeing it in probably the top echelon of Radiohead albums even there, because I think they've got a lot of good albums to come, and my favourite album is Amnesiac, so that's like a little bit down the way, but I really like the latest stuff, but this is really good transitional album. I mean, for me, I see it as Radiohead's Revolver in a lot of ways, and I would have been interested to see how this album would have been rated over time had the band broken up. So you remember Creep would have always been a radio hit. If the band broke up after this album, I'd say that this album it'd have a real cult following, I would have thought.
So good call.
Very, very interesting. So I'm interested to hear everyone's thoughts in the comments. Do you rate the bands as highly as their other outputs? We're a little bit torn on that, but we definitely agree it's a great album. Let us know in the comments. Also, check out our review on The Smile. If you haven't checked out The Smile yet, please do. It's some really amazing stuff from Tom York and Johnny Greenwood. Let us know in the comments what you're thinking.